QSO Today, episode 501, Hranac N0IVN. This episode of QSO Today is listener-sponsored. Only you can keep the QSO Today podcast coming to you every weekend since 2014. Please become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor banner on the show notes page or at the top of the QSOtoday.com webpage. I want to thank Matthew Kaufman, N3AR, for contributing to the transcription of our last episode, 500, and Thomas White, 86TW, for his monthly $10 sponsorship. There are anonymous donors, and we thank them for supporting the QSO Today project. Donations and sponsorships keep the project alive, and they are down. I hope that with 500-plus podcasts and almost 500 videos in our library, that we can more easily publish them where you watch. But this effort is not without cost. Please donate now. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio? Do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. My thanks for the kind words sent to me about my father's passing last week. As we all face this unavoidable event in our lives, we press on and work for the best in their memory. Hranac N0IVN is not only a longtime ham radio operator, but a 50-year pioneer in the cable television industry, author of hundreds of articles and presentations for the Society of Cable Television Engineers. We discuss the crossover of amateur radio and cable television technology, interference to amateur radio from leakage, and the potential opportunities for young people who want to enter the industry on the ground floor. N0IVN is my QSO Today. N0VIN, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Ron?
This is N0IVN, armchair copy, loud and clear.
Ron, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Oh, gosh, I'm going to go back even before my interest in ham radio to some of the sparks that started the fire of interest in radio and electronics. And one of the earliest memories is from about second grade when I was in Cub Scouts. I had a crystal radio kit. That was one of those with the cat's whisker detector. Our family lived in Colfax, Washington, a small farming town in eastern Washington State at the time. And I remember connecting that up and being able to hear the local AM radio station through some little earpieces. And I thought that was pretty impressive that this little radio could work without a battery. Oh, in later years during elementary school, I got a pocket AM transistor radio as a gift. And I remember being fascinated at being able to hear distant AM radio stations coming from other states that I couldn't hear in the daytime. Now, at the time, I had no idea how or why that was happening, but it was fascinating and kind of like magic. So there was another bit of a spark in this interest in radio and electronics. By the time I got to junior high school, I picked up a pair of Western Auto walkie-talkies. They were CB walkie-talkies from a friend. Another friend and I were playing around with them, and we tried to talk to each other between our two houses and couldn't quite cut it. I think the power on those walkie-talkies was maybe 100 milliwatts, if that. So I did some modifications to mine and strung up an outside antenna, and we were able to communicate with each other. Around the same time, I asked my parents for a telephone in my bedroom. And of course, they said, no way, those things cost money and we'd have to pay extra on our phone bill. We can't afford that. So no, I had, just before that, picked up a box or a trunk of surplus electronics parts from one of the teachers at the junior high school, I think for $5 or something. And it had military surplus parts from the Korean War and World War II. So I used some of those parts and built my own telephone. Rather crude, but it worked. It had one of the throat microphones that was used in airplanes, and I think probably some carbon headphones. And I used a momentary contact switch for the dial. So when I would want to dial somebody, I'd have to push the switch 5 times to get to dial the number 5. But it was crude, but it worked. Didn't have a ringer, so that answered the question there.
So you connected it to your family phone line.
I just spliced it into the phone lines in the house. It worked, and of course, it didn't have a ringer on it, so I don't think there was any way for the phone company to detect it because I believe they had ways.
Right, they were using ringer current.
Yes, so there was no ringer current on mine since there was no ringer, and I could hear the ringer upstairs on the regular phone, but it worked. I picked up an interest in Citizens Band radio, probably as an extension from the walkie-talkie, and I got a license, FCC license. At the time, the FCC still required Citizens Band radio operators to be licensed, and I remember my call sign, for whatever reason, was KGR 3511. So that was, all those things were a lot of fun and continued to focus this interest in radio and electronics over the years. But by the time, and I'd already started working in the cable industry, but I ran across a couple local friends who were in a communications wing of the Civil Air Patrol. This was in my hometown of Lewiston, Idaho. I don't remember how I got together with them, probably through a mutual friend or something. Well, they were both ham operators, and they became my Elmers. And I picked up my ham radio license in the mid-1970s, and my first call sign was WN7DSD, of course, a novice call sign. Strung up an inverted V dipole behind the house for 40 meters, and I bought a used HW16 Heathkit transceiver, and that was my first rig. One of my Elmers, Roland Unruh, W7IDT, he's silent key now, as is the other, Bob Dickinson, gave me an old military surplus transceiver. The thing had spring mount bases on it, plugged into a wall outlet. So, but it was probably from the Korean War or maybe World War II. And I think I know it operated on CW, and I think it also operated AM. So I played around with that too. But for ham radio, it was the old Hot Water 16.
That was a fine rig, actually, for a novice.
Yeah, I still have the HW16. It's up on the shelf behind me, but was unfortunately damaged during a move several years ago. So I've got to replace some tubes in it that were broken.
I read someplace that you moved 12 times. So you went to 12 schools. What was the reason for all the moves? Well,
my parents split up when I was about 8 years old, and my mom remarried. And unfortunately, the guy she married was an alcoholic. He struggled holding a job, so we moved a lot. And yes, I had attended 12 schools in 12 years. Now, high school was the same for all 3 years. Junior high was 2 different schools. And then grade school was all over the place. Couple schools in Canada, a couple schools in far northern Idaho at Sandpoint and Kootenai, and a few elementary schools in my hometown of Lewiston and right across the river in Clarkston, Washington. So we moved around a lot. And I guess I could have gone, down a wrong path with all those moves, but I buried my nose in the books and really took an interest in science and technology and things, even as a young kid. A good example was the interest in listening to those distant AM radio stations at night on that pocket transistor radio. So yeah, that was difficult. That was difficult, and finally settled down in later years. But that was rough. Made it hard to make friends because you'd be in a place for a while and we'd pack up and move someplace else. But those were, I'll call them, interesting times.
And I thought I moved a lot as a kid. I'm glad to hear that there was somebody else out there. Let me ask you, your interest in cable technology, television production, all that stuff preceded your interest in amateur radio, although maybe the interest in radio was concurrent. How did you find yourself in the cable television industry?
My first job in cable was for the cable company in my hometown of Lewiston, Idaho, as a camera operator in their local origination studio. That was in 1972. Cable companies at the time were primarily in the business of retransmission of local and distant TV stations and maybe a few FM radio stations. And they were also doing local origination in many cases. And the cable system where I started had a local origination TV studio, did a local TV newscast, and would go to local stock car races and record the stock car races and then play them back later. And then, local school sports and city council meetings and things like that. And that was where I got started. Camera operator, part-time job, and then was bumped up to a video technician. When I started there, they had a real sharp guy who was the video technician at the time. I don't remember his name, and I don't think he was a ham operator, but he really knew electronics. And when he left, I took over his job and was then responsible for maintaining the video and audio equipment, and the cameras and the studio gear and the switchers and the tape decks and all that. So that expanded the interest in electronics. And by the time Teleprompter made a corporate decision to shut down all their local origination operations nationwide, except where they were required by franchise, I had made my way to program manager and was running the local origination studio. So I had taken my original boss's job. He had moved up in the ranks of the company there at that time. But interestingly, the cable system where I started in 72, I first became aware of sort of in the late 1950s. I remember seeing these big metal boxes up on telephone poles. At the time, I had no idea what they were, but I found out later they were cable TV amplifiers. They were vacuum tube amplifiers. But I had heard of something called cable in like 1959, 1960. We had some family friends who subscribed to the local cable system, and their kids could watch Captain Kangaroo weekday mornings, but we didn't have the cable service at our house. We picked up the local Channel 3 with rabbit ears and could only get Captain Kangaroo on weekends. And then in 1972, I went to work for that very same cable system. And there were still a couple people that were there in 1972 that had been there in 1953 when the system was built. So it was fun to learn from some real pioneers in the industry. So I got the start in cable there, and then it was in the mid-70s, after I'd been in the cable industry for about 4 years, 3 or 4 years already, that I got my ham radio license.
Now, we met years and years ago when I was trying to get started in the cable industry. You were already then a leader in the Society for Cable Television Engineers. Were you one of the founders of the Society of Cable Television Engineers?
Well, not of the main society. SCTE, as the larger organization, was founded in 1969. I joined SCTE in 1979, 10 years after it was founded. But the SCTE was founded at the National Cable Show in San Francisco in 1969, and there's still a few of the charter members who are still alive. They're up there in years. I joined in 79 and moved from the Tri-Cities in Washington State. I was with Teleprompter at the time, and then joined Jones Intercable in the late 70s. And it was right after I moved to Denver in, early 80s. Well, maybe a year or two after I moved to Denver in the early 80s. I got together with a few other colleagues, Pete Smith from Rifkin and Associates, Sally Kinsman from Kinsman and Associates. She ran a design and mapping firm. And Bruce Catter, one of my colleagues at Jones Intercable. And the four of us co-founded SCTE's Rocky Mountain chapter. Well, at the time it was called a meeting group, and it had to go through certain criteria to become a chapter, but that took a year or two. But we were the co-founders of the SCTE Rocky Mountain chapter, which is still very, very active today and is one of the largest, if not the largest, chapters in the entire country.
Over the span of your career, what were some of the most significant technical challenges that you face in the cable television industry, and how did you address them?
Probably the most significant challenge, and understand that my background in the cable industry is primarily all on the technical side, I would say keeping up with the technology changes. The cable industry has, since the mid-70s when satellite communications was introduced to cable as a way to transport services like Showtime and HBO and others to cable systems all over the country. From about that time on, the technology just increased at a dramatic rate, and it was difficult to keep up with that technology. And even today, the cable industry continues to move very, very quickly through technology growth. And when I started in cable in the early 70s, I don't think there was any way we could have imagined the widespread use of optical fiber technology, satellite technology, microwave technology, high-speed data communications, telephony, and all those things over the years. So I would say probably keeping up with the technology was the tough thing. I was able to do it, I think, reasonably well. And I knock on wood because I was fortunate to have worked with a number of people over the years who were willing to share what they had learned with me. And that served as a really good example to continue to pay it forward and share what I've learned over the years with others. And I have done that, well, still doing it today, writing magazine articles, engineering papers, speaking at conferences, speaking at SCTE chapter meetings, and even conferences and things overseas.
I think one of the things that impressed me about cable technology is kind of like Microsoft Windows on DOS operating system. You start with a 330 megahertz cable system. It has its downstream channels, and it had some, what we call, I guess, T channels for the backhaul. And then you have this idea that you've got to have set-top boxes that have to do pay-per-view. So you had to kind of create technology for communicating back to the head end. And then as cable modems were introduced, you had to figure out the model is a lot of downstream speed, but not a lot of upstream speed. But then that model started changing. And I thought what was so interesting about the cable business on a technology side was that you had to keep building on these building blocks on top of the original technology, because you couldn't take the whole system down in order to rebuild it the way you wanted to. So you had to kind of evolve it. Was that your experience in the business yourself?
Early on, I'd say yes. The system where I started in northern Idaho had recently, by the time I started, had recently been upgraded from vacuum tube amplifier technology, and it was limited to just 3 channels. But when I started there, the system had been rebuilt with Vicoa Futura 12 solid-state amplifiers. They have nice gold-colored housings, 12-channel capable, and the system had 11 active channels. And I remember must have been about 76, 77 time frame, the system installed a 10-meter satellite dish to pick up 1 channel, and it was Showtime. It was a pay channel. In those days, the FCC required the use of a 10-meter diameter satellite dish to receive satellite channels. And those things were $90,000 to $100,000 in mid-70s dollars. So obviously much, much more today. I remember we put that satellite dish in for 1 channel. Our conditional access was not a converter or a set-top box. We used negative traps from Zytec, and they looked like a piece of coiled-up coaxial cable that was installed out at the pole or the pedestal where the customer's cable connected to the cable TV network. And those things were, they just removed the single channel. So they were a negative, what was called a negative trap. So it was a notch filter that removed the 1 channel, in that case, Showtime. And in order for the customer to receive it, that trap had to be removed, and then the coax drop connected directly to the distribution tap so that people could receive the service or the pay channel. And at the time, I remember thinking, how is this going to be successful? Charging that extra money for a single pay channel. Well, it was, and of course the advent of geostationary satellite technology in the mid-1970s really kicked the industry off on a near vertical growth curve. And a lot of systems did, as you say, build on some of the base technology, but by virtue of all these new services that were coming down the pike, a lot of systems did have to be upgraded again. And they had to get rid of the old single-ended amplifiers and replace them with push-pull amplifiers so they could carry channels in what's called the mid-band. And that's the frequency range in between the upper end of the FM broadcast band and the frequency where channel 7 starts. So then they could add another half dozen or so channels to that spectrum. But of course, the TV sets of the day couldn't tune those channels for the most part. So the cable company had to provide some kind of a set-top box or a block converter to block down convert the mid-band channels to either the low band or the VHF high band, so people could tune into those channels. And then the conditional access just started some crazy growth curves too, because once people realized where these new channels were, we could figure out a way to receive them perhaps without having to pay for them. So cable companies started to introduce scrambling technology, which scrambled the video. And then the pirate market, of course, came out with ways to defeat the the scrambling and the boxes. And so it was an ongoing battle of the pirates versus the manufacturers, and trying to keep a step ahead of the pirates to ensure that the conditional access was in fact conditional.
How has your expertise in cable television engineering influenced your amateur radio activities?
Oh, big time. I wrote an article for Broadband Library magazine a few months ago that talked about that, and it's titled "Hamming It Up." So if you do a Google search for Broadband Library magazine, and then look under the columns, look for primary source, and that's where my columns are. And there's one on there called "Hamming It Up," and I talked in that article about how ham radio affected my career in cable telecommunications, and how the work that I did with cable technology affected my involvement in the hobby of ham radio. And I think the two complemented each other so nicely and so well. Ham radio, of course, is RF. Cable television is RF, along with a bunch of other stuff. But the two seem to mesh together nicely and complement each other. And there are things I learned from ham radio that I could apply to cable engineering. There are things I learned in cable engineering that I was able to apply to ham radio.
And now this mid-show break. The QSO Today project that now includes 500 episodes of the QSO Today podcast, the curation of hundreds of hours of QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo presentations for public consumption, is now supported completely by you, the listeners. I am using a business model called Value for Value, a concept developed by Adam Curry, K5ACC, where you contribute to QSO Today exactly what you think its value is to you. Value for Value. This mid-show break and the promotion of the Ham Radio Workbench podcast later in the show are the only commercials that interrupt the program. QSO Today has no commercial sponsors to influence the content, direction, and editorial content of the QSO Today project, which exists solely for the promotion of the amateur radio hobby. Those of you that have listened to over 500 podcast episodes know that I'm not only infatuated by the amateur radio hobby, but by the people who perpetuate it as well. The hours that I dedicate to QSO Today is a half-time job. Your support at any level pays for all of the technology that I use to create, produce, host, and deliver the QSO Today podcast and the project to the ham radio community. And while it is a labor of love, it costs money. I know from statistics and surveys that only 6% of you actually contribute to QSO Today in some form. Please make a generous donation using the slider to set the amount of your donation. Make that donation monthly to ensure that QSO Today is here for the next 500 episodes. As a value-for-value donation, it should be in the amount that you value each episode of QSO Today, or your access to our amazing catalog of ham radio educational videos found on YouTube, Vimeo, and using our own player, link in the show notes page. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually. Use my Amazon link in the right column of the QSO Today website before shopping on Amazon. Promote QSO Today to your friends and family by forwarding our email and social media posts. Subscribe to our mailing lists. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. Tell your friends. All of these actions are value for value. Keep the QSO Today project alive by taking action now. We return to our QSO Today. You actually spent quite a lot of time involved in perhaps the elimination of interference between CATV and ham radio and vice versa. Can you talk about that, and were there some specific skills that you not only learned and developed and perhaps gave to both sides in order to be compatible?
There's actually a more formal relationship there. I've been a member of the ARRL's EMC committee for many years, even going back to when it was called the RF Interference Committee. In that role, I have served and continue to serve as the main liaison between the cable industry and the American Radio Relay League for suspected cable-related interference to and from ham radio. And even if a situation's not able to be resolved locally, it typically gets elevated to the league. And if it's believed to be cable-related, then I get involved and try to help the complainant sort things out locally if possible. And if that's not able to be done, then I get some of the corporate engineering folks that I know at the company that owns that system involved, if necessary, to help resolve things. There have been a few cases over the years where a complaint of interference went to the FCC, and the FCC actually has a relationship with the ARRL. Well, they will boot the complaint down to the ARRL, then the league will contact me and get me involved in that. In the early days of that role, a lot of the interference was in the VHF midband. For instance, a real common one was interference to a repeater in the 2-meter ham band operating on 146.25 megahertz, I believe. So the visual carrier frequency for analog channel 18 in the cable network. So if leakage of the visual carrier was strong enough in the over-the-air environment, it could cause interference to people trying to receive signals from repeaters. So there was a lot of that. It wasn't until the cable industry started deploying two-way services and transmitting signals in the upstream that we started to see complaints of potential ham interference suspected to be coming from cable TV leakage in the upstream spectrum, which is 5 megahertz to, in those days, 42 megahertz. Interestingly, most of that interference in the return path is not ham radio or is not cable related. It appears to be, but what it turns out to be, and this is even true today, is Part 15 devices that are defective and are coupling common mode current to the outside surface of the cable TV coax, and that propagates up to the telephone poles and along the hardline feeder cables. And a ham getting interference, like a broadband noise-like interference, will say, well, that's got to be leakage of digital signals coming from a cable modem and interfering with my radio communications. And invariably what we find out is it's not anything to do with cable. It's a Part 15 device or something else that's coupling interference to the outside surface of the coax. And that's the problem. And that's not a cable TV interference problem. We see more of that. The good news is that over the years, as the cable industry has rolled out two-way services and high-speed data and security services and telephone services, they've paid a lot more attention to leakage. The leakage issues and complaints that go to ARRL have gone down to maybe 1 or 2 a year. I remember when we'd see 1 or 2 a month sometimes, but the complaints are almost non-existent. A couple a year, that's not too bad. Most of the time, it's not cable related, but sometimes it is, and sometimes we do have to get the corporate engineering folks involved to get it sorted out. And it's a matter of fixing the leakage and things operate just fine. But I am really grateful that the industry has been much more aggressive about signal leakage monitoring and repair over the years than they were, say, 30, 40 years ago. But these days, the industry does a really good job. As the industry has expanded its carriage of frequencies or signals at much higher frequencies, of course, there can be concern about leakage up in the much higher frequency bands potentially being an interference issue. But there, it's not so much ham radio. I don't really hear much about ham radio. It's more interference from frequencies in the LTE or cellular telephone spectrum affecting cell sites, and vice versa. Cell site transmitter signals getting into the cable network as ingress and causing interference. So that's not ham radio related, but it's still something that needs to be sorted out and fixed. And so the cable industry has found over the years that, you can have a pretty tight cable plant in the 130 megahertz range where the FCC has required leakage monitoring for decades. But the plant can still have leakage at much higher frequencies. And in fact, I was a co-author on a paper presented at a conference back in 2012 about signal leakage versus frequency. And we found that a cable network can be very, very tight from a leakage perspective. And down in the VHF aeronautical band, there's very little or no leakage at all down there. And yet up above 500, 600, 700 megahertz, there can be leakage. And it's not, if you've got a leak like a loose connector or a cracked shield or something, squirrel chewed the shield on the cable, any of those things can cause signal leakage. But it's not uniform across frequency. It's definitely not uniform across frequency. So that's been more of a challenge for the cable industry. But fortunately, the leakage detector manufacturers came out several years ago with multi-frequency digital compatible leakage detectors. And pretty much every cable operator is using those now so that they're able to find detect and fix leakage across a wide frequency range.
Can you use drones now to go up and down the cable plant and look for leaks?
I suppose somebody could. A friend and colleague of mine named Ray Thomas, who used to write articles for Broadband Library, proposed that in one of his articles several years ago. I don't know that anybody's done it, at least not to monitor for signal leakage. I know the aeronautical flyovers that are required in Part 76 of the FCC rules are still done using airplanes, where that's being done. Cable operators can do ground-based drive-outs of their plant, or they can use aircraft to measure leakage that way. I'm not aware of anybody that's actually using drones to measure signal leakage from the plant because, conceptually, sure, they could fly, or they could equip a suitable drone with leakage detection equipment and fly it up and down the plant or where the lines are and see if they can detect leakage. It would be interesting to do. Would it be practical? I don't know.
Let's go back to ham radio. What floats your boat now? After 50 years in the cable television industry, you're no longer working full-time. You're probably volunteering full-time. You're working for no money, but you're having a great time at it. But how do you spend your ham radio life now? What are the things that interest you in amateur radio?
Well, I am retired, or mostly retired. I pulled the plug on retirement about little over 3 years ago. These days, I'm active in a local ARES group. It's called ARES DEC, so Amateur Radio Emergency Services of Douglas and Elbert County. I live in Douglas County in Colorado, so it's in the southern suburbs of Denver. Active in the ARES group, and we do a lot of drills and provide emergency communication support for served agencies such as the Douglas County Sheriff's Office and other agencies. So I'm involved in that group. I've been a Skywarn weather spotter since 1990, and we tie that in. I say we, the ARES DEC group ties that in. So during foul weather, either nasty winter weather or the severe thunderstorm weather with tornadoes and other nasty things. So do a lot of weather spotting, not chasing. I'm not a chaser. I'm a spotter. So very active in that. Still active in field day. The ARES DEC group does a field day operation each year. I operate one of or I'm a co-operator of one of the stations that we do, the VHF station. So we provide the contacts for the group on 6 meters and a little bit on 2 meters and 70 centimeters, mostly 6 meters, and satellite and a few other things to get the group a few extra points. So that's a lot of fun. And I just acquired an ICOM 705, the little QRP all band, all mode rig, about 2 weeks ago. So I've been playing around with that, and I've got to say it's a rather complicated rig with an incredible feature set. So I've been playing around on the dining room table, much to my wife's dismay. So I've got the 705 set up with a couple books. I picked up Radio Today book. It's a third-party book that talks about how to program the radio. So I programmed the radio and playing around with it, learning my way through operations or operation of the radio and its many features. And I know there are a lot of features in there that I'll probably never use, but it is so capable. Yes, it's a QRP rig, but it is such a capable and fun little radio. And so I've been having fun learning my way through that one. Those are probably the main things. A little bit of mobile and portable work. Unfortunately, we live in a subdivision with HOA restrictions, so I can't put up the antenna arrays that I used to have at our other house years ago. I was very active in satellite operations and HF and VHF. I did some contests on HF and VHF, UHF contests and microwave contesting and all those things over the years. So these days it's tamed down a little bit, at least on the HF side, primarily because of the restriction on antennas.
So I saw that you had done a lecture on NVIS antennas. It seems to me that if you can keep the antenna below the fence, that you could do NVIS from your backyard in Douglas County.
Oh, and I have done that. I've done lectures on NVIS a few times to the ARES DEC group, to Rocky Mountain Ham Radio. So I've shared that knowledge in a couple different places. One time the ARRL had one of their conferences in Colorado up at Estes Park, and I was one of the speakers up there and did a presentation on NVIS, and another one I think on tracking down noise and interference. But the NVIS presentation was a fun one, and for that I use hamstick dipoles, and they're not as effective as a full-size dipole. But on 75 meters, I put up a dipole using 2 ham sticks on a little bracket and get it about 12 feet off the ground, and then enhance the performance a bit by laying out a half wavelength wire or counterpoise just on the ground directly underneath it. And that works quite well. So the nice thing about the ham stick setup is it's small, it's easy to set up, and I've even set it up during drills and exercises with our Aries Deck group, and I can be on the air in minutes with that little ham stick setup until everybody else gets the full-size dipole set up. Yes, that works. And nice thing about the ham stick, easy to rotate. So if there's local noise interference, I can rotate the dipole, null out the interference, but it doesn't affect the NVIS or near vertical incidence skywave propagation, because that RF goes basically straight up and then is refracted back almost straight down to provide coverage over roughly a 300-mile radius, give or take. And it's actually quite effective, particularly in a place like Colorado where we have mountains. It doesn't matter that the mountains are there. Don't need a line of sight. RF goes mostly up and back down again. So for NVIS operation, yes, the ham sticks do work, and I do occasionally set them up in the backyard. I've also got some shortened verticals that I've set up with counterpoises, but those are things I don't leave set up permanently. I have to go out and set them up on a tripod or whatever and string out some counterpoises and put them up in a temporary configuration so that I can take them down quickly if I need to.
Do you see yourself operating POTA, parks on the air with that 705 and your ham sticks?
That's a maybe, and it probably wouldn't be the ham sticks, because I've got one of the magnetic loop antennas that I would be using for some portable operation, and also one of the portable. Well, it's the buddy. The guy that makes the buddy pole antennas also has a buddy stick. It's a vertical. I have one of those. I will most likely use those, and I've been very tempted to get into POTA because a good friend of mine is doing POTA from Kansas. He left the Denver area, moved to the Wichita area to be closer to his son and his grandkids. And he's been real active on POTA, just incredibly active. And I've been watching his posts on Facebook about his POTA activations, and he's getting all these certificates and things. I'm thinking, that's real tempting. We don't have a lot of parks in the Denver area that are listed in the POTA registry. There's one that's on maybe a 20-minute drive from the house that I could go activate. But I'm tempted to start out perhaps being somebody who responds to POTA activations, at least get active that way first. And I can do from the backyard, and then we'll see what happens with getting out into a park and doing it remotely. Because with the 705, that'd be ideal. I could do FT8 with the laptop or some low power phone.
Well, even if you're not doing official POTA, a POTA activation could become a ham radio social event for old timers, weekly or bi-weekly or something like that. I know that, for example, in Kansas City, that there are people that go out every week, probably just to drink beer, tell lies, and operate a little bit of radio.
Part of that, too, is I think there's a POTA website where a lot of the POTA operators will list their schedules, and they'll show the frequencies that they plan to operate on and where they're going to be operating from. So you can go look at those and say, all right, I'm going to go look for that person, see if I can provide them some points. So I think that's a lot of fun. And yes, if there are some local POTA operators who are getting together in some of the parks that can be activated here in Colorado, I may make my way to one of those sites and join the party, so to speak.
If you look back on your cable television and your ham radio career, what would you say is the one thing that you're the most proud of? Well, in the
cable television career, I'm going to say that it's sharing what I know with others. That I've almost made a mainstay of my career, or certainly a primary part of it. And I mentioned earlier that the inspiration from some of the pioneers that I worked with very early on who were willing to share what they do. And that really did set such a good example. And I started writing magazine articles in 1985 for Communications Technology and wrote for them until they ceased publication at the end of 2012. I still write for Broadband Library. I have written or co-authored quite a few papers for NCTA and the SCTE. I've published papers in conferences overseas. I've spoken at conferences all over the world. And in every case, I've tried to make that whole effort one of sharing things that I've learned over the years. And what I like to do is to try to take some of the complex topics in technology and translate them, if you will, into something that's a bit easier to understand. So over the years, I've written hundreds of articles and papers, and I still get comments from people to this day saying that they collected those articles and copies of them and still have original copies of the magazine or photocopies of the articles, and they note that they appreciated the way that I was able to communicate those complex concepts in a way that was much easier to understand. So I think in my career, that's probably my proudest accomplishment. I'm still doing it, still speaking from time to time, not as often as I used to, but still writing, primarily for Broadband Library. It's still doing an occasional SCTE paper. So still active in that respect. Also active on a volunteer basis in some standards specifications development groups through SCTE and Cable Labs and IEEE. And the same thing there, contributing to standards and leaving a thumbprint or a footprint in some of those documents, but it's sharing knowledge. And that to me is my proudest accomplishment in a half century of working in cable technology. As far as ham radio, I've considered it an opportunity to learn, but maybe the people part of it. I made so many friends through ham radio over the years, and I think that's probably the best part of ham radio. I knock on wood, during my business career, I did a lot of overseas travel, and I was able to pick up reciprocal or temporary licenses in Brazil, Australia, Great Britain, Taiwan. Take ham radio equipment with me and operate in those places, and made friends locally. Got active with some of the local ham clubs, just primarily through friends and colleagues. That part, of course, was a lot of fun. But there were times when I remember one instance in particular, I contacted a ham in Taipei on 10 meters about, 2 or 3 weeks before a business trip to Taiwan. And I told him I was going to be there in 2 or 3 weeks. So he said, well, here's my telephone number. Call me when you get here. And I did. I checked into the hotel, and he came and picked me up, and I went to his house and met his family, and we had some tea and fruit, and just a wonderful visit. And I've done that in other countries, in Europe, and of course in some states around the U.S. and in Hawaii. I went to a ham's place in Hilo, and this was quite a few years ago, and had boiled peanuts for the very first time at his place, and he let me operate his station. So there are just so many examples of that, of the people part. The other part, I think, is the public service part. Yes, it is fun to operate on the air. It's fun to make friends on the air. It's fun to compete in an occasional contest. But the people part that to me is just, I think, the most important of ham radio. There's a camaraderie that one can enjoy from the hobby part of it, the public safety and service part of it, and helping during emergencies, helping during drills and exercises, and then getting to play with the technology at the same time.
With the rapid advancements in technology that we're seeing now, what do you think the future of cable technology and amateur radio is?
I think in both cases, the technology is going to continue to improve. We've seen in ham radio widespread adoption of digital signal processing and software-defined radio equipment. That is all over the place in the hobby these days. The little ICOM 705 I got uses SDR for most of the HF band, and then it uses down conversion on the higher frequencies, and then SDR technology. So and sophisticated DSP technology. So we'll continue to see a lot of that. We'll continue to see advances in digital technology. Things like FT8, I just boggle my mind. Yes, CW is that's the mainstay of when you can't get through, CW will get through. But some of these new digital technologies like FT8 can also get through when conditions are really pretty poor. And when you look in the cable industry has widely adopted fiber optics technology, digital transport over cable networks. There are very few cable systems that still have analog television signals on their cable networks. Almost everything's converted to digital these days. Now, technically, you can argue that that those digital signals on the coax are still analog. They are. It's analog RF, but it's analog RF carrying digital data. So the cable industry is doing that on a widespread basis all over the world. Yes, there's still some cable systems that have a few analog TV channels, but the industry's been migrating over the last 20 plus years to all digital operation. These days, the cable industry has made the move to much higher frequencies. When I started in cable, the bandwidth of the cable system where I worked was a little over 50 megahertz to 220 megahertz, had 12 channel capacity. These days, modern cable networks are being upgraded to 1.8 gigahertz on the upper end. And the bottom end is still down at 5 megahertz. The upstream spectrum is expanding from the legacy subsplit band plan of 5 to 30 megahertz or 5 to 42 megahertz, now up to 5 to 85 megahertz for mid-split, 5 megahertz to 204 megahertz for high split. And there's some that are even looking at going much higher in frequency to increase the RF bandwidth available for upstream transmissions, while the downstream spectrum is expanded to accommodate an expansion of downstream signal transmission. And the industry has adopted DOCSIS 3.1 and DOCSIS 4.0 technology. Now, DOCSIS is the name of a standard for data communications over cable. That means data over cable service interface specifications. That's DOCSIS. You find the specs on the Cable Labs website. But these days with DOCSIS 3.1 and later, OFDM and OFDMA, that's orthogonal frequency division multiplexing and orthogonal frequency division multiple access, are being used in cable networks. We still have single carrier QAM or quadrature amplitude modulation. Those are 6 megahertz wide. But the OFDM signals in the downstream for DOCSIS 3.1 are minimum of 24 megahertz bandwidth to a maximum of 100 or 192 megahertz bandwidth for one channel. So the old days of 6 megahertz wide TV channels in cable networks they're still there, but not as important as what the industry is doing with DOCSIS 3.1. So I think we're seeing the adoption of digital signal processing and advanced technology in set-top boxes and cable modems. And the set-top box these days is no longer just a set-top box that converts channels that we couldn't otherwise receive to a channel that we can receive, like channel 3 or channel 4. They no longer have sync suppression, descrambler technology in them. It's all done digitally these days. So digital encryption and the technology continues to grow and improve in cable. And I think we're going to continue to see that. I fully expect in my lifetime we will see 3 gigahertz cable networks, maybe more, maybe up to 7 or 8 gigahertz with 25 plus gigabits per second symmetrical through what we call HFC or hybrid fiber coax cable networks, which boggles the mind. We're talking fiber optic type speeds, but with coax still being used for the last mile. The industry will migrate, I think, to all fiber at some point in the future, but for the time being, it's still mostly HFC with a little bit of fiber to the home. And all that's going to continue to grow and prosper, as it were, as the industry adopts these new technologies and rolls out wider bandwidths in the networks and more services.
And now this mid-show break. Every 2 weeks, I listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast with George, KJ6VU, Vince, VE6LK, Mark, N6MTS, Thomas, K4SWL, Michael, VA3MW, and Rod, VA3ON, and their guest on often topical and important projects in amateur radio. This discussion amongst the regulars and their guests remind me of the conversations that I used to listen to on 146.94 and 146.46 megahertz in Orange County, California, while working on my own workbench almost 50 years ago. It is amazing how much practical ham radio knowledge that we can absorb by listening to the Workbench podcast that starts to make sense when we start our own deep dive into our own projects. So join me by listening to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast now and as George and crew push beyond 200 episodes. You can get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast by clicking on the banner in this week's show notes page. And now, back to our QSO. As a young person, I always heard the old people disparage the young people. And now that I'm an old person, I'm looking at the young people and are thinking of disparaging them. It seems to me, though, that perhaps you have an idea of whether there's enough young people that are coming into the industry to kind of take off where you left off. What advice would you give to young engineers and technologists who might have an interest in today's telecommunications environment? And are those people there? Do you see those people coming into the industry?
Well, the answer is yes, they're there. But the young people coming into the industry in engineering roles primarily don't have training or background in RF technology. That's really hard to find in universities these days. It's there, but most people that come through engineering programs in schools these days have backgrounds in computer technology, data technology, which is definitely important as the cable industry moves on its trajectory down that all digital path. But my advice to young people getting into the industry is never stop learning, never stop asking questions, and be sure to share what you have learned with others. I would say if there's a challenge in the technology side of things, it's not the number of people joining the industry. I don't think that's been a problem. It's that expertise in RF that's not there. It's the expertise in HFC networks that's not there. The people who understand that technology are like me. They're old and gray-haired older and gray-haired, more mature or something like that.
Mature. Yeah, I like that better.
And yeah, mature. We'll use that. My wife might argue with the use of the word mature to describe my personality, but that's a different subject.
Well, all our wives would, generally.
Yeah.
But that's why you're in your basement ham shack and I'm in my basement ham shack, is they disparage us, but they know where we are.
That's true. That's a good point. And she doesn't worry about me. If I go out someplace, it's to the local ham radio store or the local telescope store or something. But one of the things that I'm doing in an engineering group under SCTE that I chair, it's called the Network Operations Subcommittee Working Group 1, and it's about measurements. We're working on a series of technical monographs that cover topics that discuss technology more from a high-level perspective that many new people in the industry may not be familiar with or don't have a background in. And we want to archive that knowledge. So it's going to be on SCTE standards download page. We got the approval from the engineering committee to develop that series of monographs. And the first one we did, it hasn't been published on the standards page yet, so it's got to go through formatting and final editing at SCTE headquarters. It's called What is the Decibel? That's the starting point. And the others that we're working on include what is loss, the attenuation type, what is return loss, what is velocity of propagation, and that would be in coaxial cable. And others that we're going to be developing include things like what is carrier to noise ratio, what is S parameters, and so on. So we're going to be picking a whole bunch of topics. We've got a pretty good sized list, and I expect it's going to keep the working group busy for the next couple years, developing the content or repurposing some previous content into the proper format. And then that'll be made available on SCTE's standards download page. And there will be a lot of good reference information that covers a lot of this basic technical background that I think serves as a good foundation for those who are new to the industry and really don't have that background in RF engineering, because all of that will form a nice foundation for RF engineering and technology.
I saw that you're actually making some of these videos with a Volpe Engineering website on YouTube. So What is the Decibel is there, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes page. Could you talk a little bit about your association with Volpe Engineering and the creation of these videos?
A couple of years ago, Brady Volpe and his wife approached me at SCTE's Cable Tech Expo, and they said, Ron, John Downey, who was a colleague of mine at Cisco, had been doing a lot of these video live streams with Brady on DOCSIS technology. And Brady and his wife, Mia, said, Ron, we'd love it if you could do monthly live streams with us on RF technology and some of the basics there, because they asked John, and he said, let Ron do it. That's his favorite subject to talk about. So I said, let me think about it a little bit and think about ways we could do it. So we've done maybe a half dozen or so of these live streams. And yes, What is the Decibel is one of them. I think Putting the decibel to work is another. We probably did one on carrier to noise ratio and some other topics. And the most recent one I did is about the half-wave dipole antenna. And of course, the main focus and application of that to cable technology is the half-wave dipole antenna has long been used for signal leakage monitoring and measurements in cable networks. And it also serves as the foundation for most antennas that are used in just about any type of RF engineering. But the cable industry, of course, has used antennas to pick up over-the-air TV stations and FM signals and other things. So the dipole has a bit of a foundation there too. So I just did that and showed him. We covered the basics of the dipole, and I showed some homemade dipole antennas that I've used for VHF up through the 23 centimeter ham band, and showed a couple examples of how to make a dipole and how they could be used for a number of purposes. So that's a fun thing, working with Brady on that. So we get together once a month, most of the time, and do a live stream, and that gets recorded and he posts it on his webpage or his YouTube channel.
Is there still an entryway into the cable television industry for the high school graduate who hasn't gone to engineering school, like it was 40 years ago, where you could join a cable system and become an installer and then work your way up through the engineering ranks? Is that opportunity still available in cable systems?
I think it is. A lot of cable companies these days have developed formal training programs. Comcast, for instance, has, I think they still call it Comcast University. So they have formal in-house training programs for their employees, and it covers everything from installer up through senior engineering positions in the system level and even at the regional level. So I don't know what kind of programs Charter has, but as far as I know, there's still entry-level points for those who have an interest in cable technology to get started working as an installer and learning the ropes and making their way up the ladder through the ranks of technician and maintenance tech and so on. So it's still there. The senior engineering positions that show up at the regional level and the corporate level, I think, require university degrees most of the time. But yes, there's still an entry point for folks to get involved at the field level and climb their way up the pole.
And climbing up the pole, is it possible that one of these big MSOs would even pay for university education for the most promising students who look like they could go to senior engineering level?
I think that's going to be company specific. Some companies probably have tuition reimbursement programs for that kind of education. I know the SCTE has a scholarship program available, and they have awarded scholarships to techs in the field who have taken NCTI courses or maybe local college courses at a 2-year school. So there is tuition assistance available out there. I'd be real surprised if most of the cable companies don't have some kind of a tuition assistance program to help people earn a degree, whether it's a 2-year degree or even a 4-year degree.
You're a member of the Denver Astronomical Society. Is that right? You also have telescopes?
I have several telescopes. I'm a past president of the Denver Astronomical Society and a current member of its board of directors. Very active in public outreach with astronomy. That's another hobby that I enjoy. My wife gives me a bad time about my hobby is having hobbies.
They're expensive.
Yeah, they tend to be expensive. So ham radio and astronomy and rock collecting and the list goes on. But yes, I'm very active in Denver Astronomical Society. Just did a lecture the other evening on how to observe the sun, the safety necessary for all that. But yes, that's definitely another fun hobby. Cloudy today, so I can't go outside and observe the sun, which is a shame because there's good sunspots.
Do you see overlap between the astronomers and ham radio operators? Do you do any radio astronomy?
I've played with it a little bit in the past. One of our members who was a ham operator, in fact, he and I used to team up in the 10 gigahertz and up ARRL contest years ago, and he's a silent key now. But he had set up a direct TV or dish network dish with a little receiver, and we would aim that thing at the sun, and you could look at the radio energy coming from the sun with that. So yes, we would play around a little bit with radio astronomy type things. Although within the Denver Astronomical Society, I don't think there's a big interest in radio astronomy. I think there's some people have been curious about it because the planet Jupiter, for instance, is a great source of radio emissions. I have listened to some of the emissions from Jupiter with a short wave set in years past. It's some very interesting sound. So that's tying together astronomy and radio a little bit. So I've played with that part of it. I keep threatening to maybe set up a receiver at one of our open houses at Chamberlain Observatory and put up an antenna when Jupiter's up in the night sky and see if we can hear some of the radio emissions from Jupiter. And I suspect that would probably pique the interest of at least a few people to say, wow, you can hear radio signals from Jupiter. So yeah, I kind of tie together a little bit of ham radio technology with astronomy.
Before we go, Ron, what advice would you give to new or returning hams to the hobby?
Oh gosh, I think the advice I would give to new or returning hams is be active and don't be intimidated by the modern technology. Sometimes it can be a little intimidating to get one of these new radios, whether it's a handy talkie or a full-fledged base transceiver that's got so much capability and technology in it. Don't be intimidated by it. In fact, as you look at the hobby, learn as much as you can or as little as you want. But I like the approach of learn as much as you can about the technology, just to see the incredible diversity that we have in technology available to us, whether it's from old-fashioned CW communications to some of the most advanced modern digital communications techniques to good old-fashioned phone on HF or the higher bands, maybe meteor scatter or Earth, Moon, Earth. There's so much that one can enjoy in this, and I would just encourage people, learn as much as you can. Get involved in a club if there's one near you, and make friends, learn from them. See if there's a particular part of the hobby that really sparks your interest. Is it just casual chit chats and making friends? Is it getting involved in emergency communications, contesting, DXing, trying to contact some of those distant stations in other countries? There's so much that somebody can do in this hobby, and I'd say take advantage of what's there.
The hardest thing a newcomer or even someone returning has is just choosing that one path to start. It looks very daunting with all of these choices.
Yes. It's like coming to a fork in the road, but there are 10 different roads that you can take at that fork and say, which one do I take? Well, experiment a little bit with each of them or hang around with some Elmers and learn a little bit more about some of them to see if those are things that interest you. If they aren't, that's fine. There are so many other things that somebody can learn about and become proficient in and I think really get a lot out of.
Ron, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. We met years and years ago. We're both aging well. Since the last time I spoke with you, which was probably 30 years ago, you've changed the industry. You've made your huge mark in it in terms of the compilation of papers and presentations that you've made. And so I just want to thank you so much for joining me and making this contribution so that we have this audio history of Hranac N0IVN.
Eric, thank you for the opportunity to chat today. It was a lot of fun and it brought back a lot of very fond memories. So thank you, and I will say 73 to you. 73.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Ron. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in N0IVN in the search box at the top of the page. You can sponsor the transcription of this episode or any of the previous episodes by clicking on the transcription button on every show notes page. The cost is $75 per episode, regardless of the length. We will quickly transcribe the episode and give you credit for your sponsorship. Please send us the call sign of the podcast to make sure that we transcribe what you want. Remember that QSO Today is value for value. Please support our project by making a donation or becoming a listener sponsor today. Use our Amazon link before shopping at Amazon, as we receive a small commission on your Amazon purchases. Subscribe to our mailing lists, both my blog and the podcast, and forward the messages to friends and family who would enjoy QSO Today content. Promote us on social media and give us a 5-star rating and reviews whenever you are asked. QSO Today is available on every podcast player and venue, including Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, and Podcasting 2.0. Get a Podcasting 2.0 player to make it easy to get your next episode as soon as we publish. My thanks to Ben Bresky, who, as the consummate artist, makes this host and his guests always sound brilliant. Ben also publishes a weekly Jewish history podcast. There is a link to that on the QSO Today homepage. Until next time, this is Eric for Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.